My name is Dr. Kujawa, Joanna for you, and I would like to welcome you to my presentation on the archetypes of successful women in myth and history. This presentation is prepared for a conference in Bali on women's leadership and empowerment in March 2020. So I'm going to start showing my PowerPoints and discussing the main points. I also apologize if I have to rush a little bit because I'm aware of the time limit. So I'm just going to go to screen share right now. That's it. So the archetypes of successful women in myth and history. And I will just jump right into this. So why we are going to talk about archetypes? First of all, an archetype as such, as a concept, comes from Carl Jung, especially as it is embodied in psychology and psychoanalysis and in modern times that we use. So basically, he calls them the primordial types with universal images that existed in our consciousness, or more precisely in our subconscious, in the remotest times. And there are all kinds of interesting theories, why they are there, but we are not going to go into this at this presentation, maybe next presentation. And it is like a specific stamp that has been handed down through long periods of time, and it is embedded in our subconscious. So what is our subconscious really in this respect? We are talking about something that it is just below our conscious level of thinking, which means this in a very serious way influences us. And however, my argument here, which is in some ways perhaps a feminist argument, is that, this archetypes, and this works both for women and men, by the way, because when I use that terminology such as patriarchy, I'm not saying anything against men, but rather I'm discussing a system that is outdated for both women and men. So what I'm arguing in this presentation, that these archetypes were manipulated to demean women, and that women, that's why we gather at this conference, have to truly empower themselves, not in some kind of exterior way, but although it is also a part of this, but we have to start with our inner empowerment. Only when we truly empower ourselves from within, and it comes for both women and men, then we can empower ourselves in a truly authentic way externally as well. And that's why I want to deal with these very internal things, which are called, archetypes by Carl Jung. So I decided, just for fun, and also because of my long life passion for the archetypes and mythologies of different cultures, both Western and Eastern, to focus on certain archetypes of goddesses, because goddesses are nothing else but the archetypes that are somehow, embedded in our subconscious and are externalized as divinities to be worshipped. So here I'm looking first at the archetype of goddesses of love. So the first goddess of love is very well known for everybody. This is a famous painting by Italian painter Botticelli. This is the birth of Venus. Venus is just a Roman name for Aphrodite, and the myth is that she was born from the sperm of her father that fell into the ocean, and this is the beautiful and most probably well-known representation of Aphrodite. Now, when you read the myth of Aphrodite, and there are wonderful essays written also about it. One of the most famous myths of Aphrodite is a Homeric myth of Aphrodite by Homer, of course. And there it is an interesting story, because at the beginning Aphrodite is this powerful entity, this fully empowered feminine in a very feminine way. In Jungian terms, it would be anima. Anima is the feminine side of our psyche, when animus is the masculine side of the psyche, and both women and have both. That's really important to remember. So she's fully empowered in her anima, but she's somehow not empowered in her animus, talking in Jungian terms, simply because she very quickly loses her power. So she starts from the empowerment of her feminine beauty, her awareness of her own beauty, and as a goddess of love and pleasure and beauty, and yet the moment she falls in love with a man, she completely loses her power. And there is a beautiful essay by Hawthorne that I strongly recommend for you, which is in my bibliography, which actually discusses this fall of Aphrodite. So for women, Aphrodite is basically a symbol of a woman who loses her power the moment basically that she finds herself in a relationship. And the Hindu representation of this, the same archetype, as I argue, is goddess Radha. Hindu mythology is slightly different from Greek mythology because Greek gods are a little bit like, Hollywood stars, they're not particularly spiritual. But Hindu goddesses and gods are basically more focused on the spiritual development, so to speak. So goddess Radha she was never empowered, and she doesn't look empowerment in love. Her power comes actually from surrendering to love. So it's a little bit different. It's a different paradigm or archetype of a goddess of love, someone who actually evolves spiritually and evolves as a person because of her surrender to the longing for love. Now, the next archetype that I'm going to discuss, and it's a little bit of a parody of archetype in Greek mythology, is the archetype of the wife. And in Greek mythology, this archetype is represented by goddess Hera, who was married to Zeus. And although she is, a goddess of family and a goddess of marriage, at the same time, the reason why I call her a little bit of a paradox and a sort of ridiculed goddess, it is because she lives in constant fear and constant jealousy, because as we know, Zeus had affairs all over the place with different nymphs, goddesses, and beautiful earthly women as well. So basically she spends her time trying to control an uncontrollable husband. And it's really interesting for subconscious as women to realize that whether we follow or whether we know somebody who follows, but it's better to focus on ourselves, this kind of archetype, when we basically spread our energies outwardly to control somebody, this male figure in our lives, without actually probably focusing these energies on fulfilling our own potential. So basically the life of Hera, the way I see it, is basically, trying to control this philodendron husband. In Hindu mythology, we have Parvati. So Parvati is this other ideal, which is in many ways probably unachievable for women. And this is what I also want to discuss, that some of these ideas, especially in relationship to men, either disempower women for some reason, or give away that power, like in the case of Aphrodite. And here Parvati, she's this perfect wife, completely devotional figure. Right, so she's completely devotional figure without any personal agenda, so to speak, which is in some ways a very beautiful archetype, and I don't want to speak against it simply because I don't subscribe to this. And this is an important archetype. However, I think that it in some ways limiting only if it is the only archetype, which very often happens in most cultures, both Western and Eastern, in traditional cultures especially. I'm sorry. That this is considered the only archetype for a woman. Either somebody who, is beautiful but is completely disempowered, like Aphrodite, or somebody who is basically a dutiful wife who basically has no vision for herself and for her life apart from being somebody else's partner. So this is a valid archetype, but it is a limiting archetype, especially that I believe that in traditional societies, this is basically sold to us, has been sold to us for at least 2 or more millennia as the only archetype for a woman. And nothing strange that lots of women don't feel comfortable with this, because you either are being turned into like a control freak, because again, your focus is on the masculine figure in your life instead of empowering yourself, or you just become this kind of sweet devotional figure, and you basically support your husband in his career. Now, the archetype that really interests me, and I hope that it would interest everybody who is participating in this conference, is what John Taylor, and I rely heavily on her book, and please check my bibliography at the end, calls the wisdom babe. So the wisdom babe which is basically the goddess of wisdom, and there are many permeations of goddess of wisdom, which are there in An mythology. However, they are kind of suppressed, so that's why I want to bring them back to the surface. So in Greek mythologies, of course, Athena, goddess of wisdom, often also goddess of war. So it's interesting how these two things are connected. At the same time, when I was a little girl and I, wanted to be a goddess of wisdom, I was a little bit disappointed because, I felt that she was missing certain attributes of Aphrodite, because she is very cold. She is all animus in Jungian terms. By animus, I mean she has all of these masculine qualities, that are considered with logic, wisdom, and kind of rational thinking. But she really lacks in this, what I call later and discuss later, higher wisdom, which is, for example, intuition or intellection, or in Japanese tradition, it is called satori. She represents very masculine mind. So she kind of shed the beautiful Aphrodite and other aspects of goddesses of wisdom, which I discuss later. And in many ways, I think that as women in academia, we very often, or in business, as you are aware of it when I'm talking to both at this stage, subscribe unconsciously to this archetype of the wisdom babe as Athena, which is losing certain beautiful feminine qualities, which actually could empower us. So again, in Hindu tradition, we have Saraswati, which is a little bit more feminine, as you see. In fact, she's one of my favorite goddesses of all. She's a goddess of words, and, she's also the protector of writers, and an intellectuals, and she deals mostly with spoken and written word, and also music. As you see, she has a musical instrument. So she actually is a little bit, I would say, more attractive for me personally, and I hope for you as well, an archetype of a wisdom babe, or the goddess of wisdom, because she has not lost her qualities in Hindu mythology. And although she's being worshipped in Hindu society, it's sometimes interesting that in some societies, goddesses are being worshipped, but women are not treated particularly well. But anyway, in terms of mythology, Saraswati has this I'm sorry, has this qualities of feminine qualities that perhaps, or definitely actually, Athena lost. I have to apologize for the cough. I have a bad sinus infection. That's why this absence. Now, another archetype is the independent adventurer or a demon slayer, and in Greek mythology here, we have goddess Artemis, which in Roman mythology was called Diana. She's called goddess of hunt, but she's just actually this outdoorsy goddess. So this is the adventurer, this is the traveler in all of us, right? So that's why we want to go to Bali, we want to go everywhere, we travel, we have adventures. If you're this kind of woman, then you definitely and Artemis. In Hindu tradition, it is Durga, sometimes doubled with Kali, Durga Kali, and she's the slayer of demons also. So she's a very independent woman. She's a fighter. She's more of also a warrior goddess there, but more in spiritual terms. She's often portrayed riding either a lion or a tiger. So it means she's in full control of all her inner and outer demons. And in fact, she's in control of any demons, external or internal. So she's a woman that is in control, or a goddess that is in control, And if you need empowerment, to call upon goddess Durga or Durga Kali. It's quite interesting, yet returning to Western mythology, that in Western mythology, these are, and actually in Eastern, look at them, right? They have goddesses that need to be feared. So I think that it is quite interesting that the empowered feminine here, the traveler, the adventurer, the independent, she is in control. She's a goddess that needs to be feared, because especially in Greek mythology, we have the story of Actaeon, who caught a glimpse of Artemis in the woods, with her attendants, and then she turned him into to a stag, and he was hunted and killed by his own hands. So kind of this, why was the story? I said, who is telling the story, and why they are saying it this way? Why are they telling the story? So first of all, who is telling the story, and why they are saying this way? Why they are telling it this way? So, because this creates suddenly a fear of this empowered feminine, right? she's not the jealous Hera. She is not the disempowered, beautiful, but slightly pathetic Aphrodite. She's this empowered, fun woman, who's traveling solo, who's in charge, as you see, of her own life. And yet she's portrayed as somehow dangerous to men. And I think this myth in itself is dangerous. Not that she's empowered, but that it is shown this way in the myth. Whoever started to say this myth, started to describe this myth, that an empowered woman is somehow dangerous to men. And imagine the damage that it creates in women and men relationship and in the world. And that's why our world is so much out of balance, because we are in need of feminine power that is not threatening to anyone, that doesn't frighten anyone, So I think it goes back to this archetype of Artemis. So I want to go back to the question, who defines the feminine? And I love this this typology by John E. Taylor. So especially with respect to goddesses of wisdom, and I know I have to speed up my presentation now. It is one of the guys, women as bearers of secret knowledge, which is my favorite part. I have no time to present much on this, but if you're interested, I have a YouTube channel and a blog. Bad women or stuck-up bitch, and sexualizing of powerful women in the past to demean them. There's nothing wrong with being sexy. That's why I said, I had a problem with Athena, because, she lost certain feminine qualities, but, sexuality, women's sexuality was used to demean them, and is continued to be used to be demeaned. So one of the boys, or honorary male, one example, because now I'm going to example in earthly women, is Hypatia of Alexandria, who lived in the 4th century. She was killed by a Christian mob in 415. She was a Neoplatonic philosopher in Alexandria. She was teaching in the famous Library of Alexandria. I believe she was a daughter of a philosopher. She was a well-established philosopher, but like Athena, she had, although she was known for her beauty, she had to shed, all her feminine qualities to be respected. So this is sad. And of course, at the same time, and again, this is the archetype that we very often follow in academia and business world, and we have to ask ourselves, why do we have to follow this? Because, as you know, anything associated with the feminine is being sexualized and is being used against women to demean them. So I guess Hypatia was also in the same situation, and her story is very tragic, because she was a brilliant philosopher, and as I already mentioned, she was killed by a Christian mob, and in a very brutal way. I'm not going to describe it. And and this is how her career ended. So it also asks, we can ask ourselves questions about, early Christianity and all traditional religions, and about treatment of women, especially empowered women, and especially intellectually empowered women like Hypatia, so she was killed in a brutal way. But I want to say that she was treated as honorary male, which already by itself signifies that, she couldn't fully show her anima. She had to move towards her animus, or her masculine part within her psyche, to be successful then. And I think very often in our lives, even nowadays, women, we have to do this. Now, my favorite topic is carriers of secret knowledge, and I publish about it a lot. So what happened to them? So for everybody, I would say, who knows anything about Greek philosophy, but any educated person, especially, if you're familiar with Western culture, is Pythagoras, the famous, he's mostly nowadays known as a mathematician, but he also was a great mystic and great philosopher, which is sometimes less well known. And he had a wife called Theano. Now, why we say wife? Because in history, in traditional history and later history, she's known as his wife, but actually, she was not only his wife, she was also an independent mathematician and philosopher and mystic herself. And in fact, after his death, she ran his school. And it is important to say that there were many women philosophers in the school of Pythagoras, and that, why don't we know their names? Why don't we know their names? And only some scholars, and I really encourage you to look at my bibliography, talk about it. But why do we give this privilege only to male philosophers? And then later, you know, people are being told, oh, we don't learn about women philosophers because there weren't any, which is not true. They were just erased edited out from our history. Now, it's quite interesting that Pythagoras had a female teacher. Her name was Themistoclea, and who was also Delphic oracle and priestess. And there were all other 15 philosophers, women philosophers in his school. So he actually learned, you know, his trade as a philosopher, mystic, and a mathematician, because these things were connected, you know, especially in mystical form of philosophy, by a woman. How come nobody heard about her and everybody hears about him? I'm not going here for competition. I'm just saying, you know, like, give credit to both. I'm all for gender reconciliation. You know, we just need to give credit where it belongs. You know, of course, Pythagoras was a famous and a great philosopher, mathematician, and mystic, but so was Theano, so was Themistoclea. Now, another story that I very briefly would like to touch upon is Sappho, which is a famous Greek poet, and for example, who was especially, you know, and she had her own school, and who was especially ridiculed by later in history. And it's quite interesting that she was not really ridiculed until 1st century BC, which is basically 500 years later after she was active. So in many ways, 600 before Common Era was more progressive than, you know, our times or the times that came after that, because, you know, only about 5th century BC that she was actually starting to be ridiculed and said that she was basically, you know, extremely, well, they called her a whore, basically, that she was very sexually promiscuous, that she slept with her students, you know, that she likes girls, there's nothing wrong with it, but that was not used as a way of defining her as a lesbian poet. It was used as a way of ridiculing her, when in fact we know nothing about her sexuality, you know. So, so her sexuality was used to ridicule her, but only 500 years later, after she lived. So it usually came, I think, with the Roman Empire, which was much more misogynistic, it seems, even when early Greece, although, you know, Athens were also misogynistic, and I'll speak about it later. And then what is closer to our history, and this is my personal obsession, Mary Magdalene and the Gnostic Gospels. Again, the same story over and over again. Research was done, you know, by many scholars, including myself, and yet in public imagination, Mary Magdalene is still the biblical prostitute, when in fact I'm telling you as a scholar that there is no evidence even in the Bible that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. It was an unnamed woman, you know, but and even this unnamed woman was not a prostitute, you know, that Christ defended in the story. And in fact, in Gnostic Gospels, which were discovered in 1945 in Nag Hammadi in Egypt, which are the Gospels that were rejected by the Council of Nicaea in the 4th century, they portrayed Mary Magdalene as the favorite disciple of Jesus and possibly his partner. Whether she was his partner or not is less of an interest to me at the moment, but it is that she was considered his most advanced disciple. And there is, of course, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, when she's portrayed as a favorite disciple of Christ. There is the Gospel of Philip, where she's portrayed in such a way as well. And there's another Gnostic word called Pistis Sophia, in which she's portrayed as his favorite disciple as well. And yet, again, as in other cases, the fact that she was a beautiful and possibly sexually empowered woman was turned against her to demean her. And all her spiritual accomplishments as a favorite disciple of Jesus were forgotten or erased from history, because in the Council of Nicaea, it was decided which Gospels go to the Bible and which stay out of the Bible. And interestingly enough, all the Gospels that portrayed Mary Magdalene as the favorite disciple of Jesus were taken away. Now, I think my last, or the one before last, actually the last archetype is the stuck-up bitch, right? According to John T. Taylor, forgive me, this is a terminology by John T. Taylor, an Oxford scholar. So we have here Aspasia, 5th century BC. She was Pericles' wife, partner, and a politician and a philosopher. She was described in Platonic dialogues or dialogues by Plato as a teacher, as a philosopher, and also in many other dialogues. And then again, around 500 BC and throughout Christianity, she becomes basically the evil woman, the stuck-up bitch. How did she dare? Right? How did she dare? She probably actually created Peloponnesian War, which Athenians lost because nobody knows why. But, she, this terrible woman, like Eve, another biblical figure, has to be responsible for all failures of men, when in fact she's a highly accomplished woman, not only a partner of a great Athenian politician, but a philosopher on her own terms. And yet the closer we move to modern times, the closer we move to Christian times and modern times, the more evil she becomes, and her intellectual assets are forgotten. In the Middle Ages, we have one figure that is standing out amazingly out of any other female figures, and this is Eleanor of Aquitaine, 12th century. She was a woman who was the Durga, who was the Athena, who was the Aphrodite. She was beautiful. Troubadours sang songs about her. She was powerful. She married King of France, and when she was not happy with him, she forced the Pope to give her a divorce, and she married young Henry II, who became the King of England, and she co-ruled with him. She went on crusades. When women were waiting at home, waiting for their husband, she went on a crusade. Not that crusade is a good thing, but I'm just showing this warrior spirit in her as well. So she was this fully empowered woman that, stands out like a Statue of Liberty, so to speak, throughout the Middle Ages, and something to perhaps aspire to as an example of a particular archetype. Now, we say that all things change when I talk about mythology and history. Well, did they really change? And I have two examples here. Let's focus on this one. This is Marie Skłodowska-Curie. Marie Curie, everybody knows, the scientist. I like to, because I'm originally Polish, I like to stress that actually she was Polish too. She just went to Sorbonne and studied there and lived in France after that, and married Pierre Curie. Her maiden name is Maria Skłodowska. So she became Maria Skłodowska-Curie. So what happened to her? She also quite unsuccessfully tried to connect the archetype of Athena and Aphrodite. And how? Well, Athena, we know, she got 2 Nobel Prizes, in 2 different scientific disciplines. She's the probably greatest female scientist of all times. And yet, after Pierre Curie died, she found herself involved with a French man, and it's okay, I will be honest here, she got involved with a French married man, so if you want, you can pass judgment on this. And, when the French press learned about it, she suddenly became this evil foreign woman, and, and she probably didn't even deserve the Nobel Prize that she got, and so on, in science. And and only when she let go of a love affair, and when she received the second Nobel Prize, she was completely, okay, so she was accepted again in French scientific circles, and she had to prove herself again, so to speak. And again, like Athena, she had to shed, this feminine side of her, so to speak. She had to let go of a love affair, whether you have judgment on this or not. The truth is, she had to let it go to be respected as a scientist. And here, that's why I chose this really ugly picture of Hillary Clinton. And I really don't know what to think about her, because, between academic press, conspiracy theories, and everybody else, I have no idea who she is, never met her, right? However, it is interesting that maybe she's an evil woman, I don't know, but maybe she is not. Maybe, you remember the story of Artemis, and, how she was the figure to be feared. Why do we fear empowered women? And it is one thing that perhaps men who are conditioned to fear empowered women, why we as women fear or hate empowered women. That's very interesting, and also from the point of view perhaps of that empowered women or other empowered women who are empowered but they are very masculine in the approach towards power, towards intellect, towards knowledge, towards people. Why are they this way? Perhaps they feel that they are forced to be this way, to be treated seriously. Otherwise, they are being demeaned the way, you know, Aphrodite was demeaned, the way Mary Magdalene was demeaned, or the way even Marie Curie was demeaned because of her brief affair, you know, after her husband died. So the point of this talk is that we really need to create new archetypes, and then we can play with all archetypes. So the archetypes are eternal, and Carl Jung would agree with this. The archetypes are eternal and are on our subconscious. We have to bring them up to our consciousness, and we have to be in charge of our archetypes, because otherwise other people, with whatever they have, whatever agendas they have, they would tell the stories for us, and they would twist the stories. They would twist the stories the way they're twisted in Greek mythology, the way they were twisted about Greek philosophers, female philosophers, the way they were twisted about Mary Magdalene. And the truth somehow survived, because look, this is, for example, a painting, famous painting of Mary Magdalene that I found from the 15th century. And how does he portray her? Does he portray her as a prostitute? No, she is the learned woman. She is reading the book. And this is, I always joke that this represents cafe latte, but it's not a cafe latte, it is the tower. And if you are familiar with the books of Margaret Starbird, you know that it's called the Tower of Jerusalem, which means that she actually comes from a royal family and that she was actually a wedded wife to Jesus. So this is one version of a story, but whether wedded or not, here it is, the empowered woman, the wise woman, standing in her power. And I think that this is how we need to look at this archetype, in a way that, you know, honor the archetypes, but also take charge of the archetypes. And this is good for both women and men, because we have to heal our relationship as women with our power, with our knowledge, and we have to heal relationship also with men in our lives, and we have to heal relationship within the world, which so desperately is in touch of true feminine power, not the false power, you know, that women sometimes feel forced to assume, you know, by emulating men, but we have to find the true feminine power within ourselves. And with this, I would really like to finish my presentation.